The first time someone mentioned the station, Elliot assumed they were mistaken. He had been living in town for less than a month. Long enough to recognize a few faces, not long enough to understand how things worked. He was walking to work when he stopped to ask an older woman for directions. She smiled politely and pointed down the road. "You can save 10 minutes if you get off at the station." Elliot looked at her. "The station?" She nodded. "Of course." Elliot hesitated. "The station is closed." The woman frowned. "No, it isn't." Then she continued walking. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Elliot forgot about it almost immediately. Until later that afternoon. A customer at the hardware store mentioned train delays. The next day, a man at a coffee shop complained about missing a train. 3 days later, Elliot overheard 2 people discussing schedules. All of them spoke as if the station were still operating. The problem was simple. The station wasn't operating. It hadn't been for years. Elliot knew because he had seen it. The old building sat near the edge of town. The entrance gate was chained shut. The ticket office was empty. Several sections of track had been removed entirely. Nobody looking at the station would assume trains still stopped there. Yet people kept talking about it. At first, Elliot assumed they were joking. Then he assumed they were exaggerating. Eventually, he realized they were serious. One Saturday morning, he decided to visit the station again. The building looked exactly as he remembered. Silent. Abandoned. A faded sign hung above the entrance. Most of the letters had peeled away years ago. Weeds grew between sections of cracked pavement. Nothing moved. Nothing suggested the place would ever operate again. As Elliot turned to leave, he noticed someone sitting on a nearby bench. A middle-aged man, coffee in one hand, newspaper in the other. Waiting. Elliot walked closer. The man glanced up. Morning. Morning. Elliot looked around. "What are you doing here?" The man seemed confused. "Waiting." "For what?" The man laughed. "The train." Elliot stared. The man returned to his newspaper. The conversation ended there. Hours later, Elliot was still thinking about it. Not because the answer was strange, because of how normal it sounded. The man hadn't seemed confused. He hadn't seemed embarrassed. He hadn't seemed like someone making a joke. He had simply answered the question. The train. Over the next few weeks, Elliot started paying closer attention. The station came up more often than it should have. A cashier mentioned it. A mechanic mentioned it. His next-door neighbor mentioned it. Different people. Different situations. Same certainty. One evening, Elliot asked his neighbor directly, "You actually use the station?" The neighbor shrugged. "Sometimes." "When was the last time?" The neighbor opened his mouth, then paused. For several seconds he appeared to think. Finally, he said, "A few weeks ago." "What day?" "I don't remember." What train? The neighbor frowned, then laughed. I don't know. Elliot waited. The neighbor looked uncomfortable, as though he had suddenly realized something was missing. Then he shrugged again. Still use it, though. That answer bothered Elliot more than it should have. A month later, he had collected dozens of conversations. Every one of them followed the same pattern. People were certain. Until details appeared. The moment specifics entered the conversation, confidence vanished. One woman claimed she took the train every month. She couldn't remember where it went. A retired teacher insisted her brother still used the station. She couldn't remember when. A grocery store owner said trains were usually late on Fridays. When asked which trains, she simply blinked, then changed the subject. The pattern became impossible to ignore. People remembered conclusions. They never remembered facts. One afternoon, Elliot visited the town library, not because he expected answers, because he wanted confirmation. The librarian pointed him toward local archives, old newspapers, town newsletters, community bulletins. Hours passed. Eventually, he found what he was looking for. Photographs, announcements, official notices. Every source agreed. The station had closed 12 years earlier, not temporarily, permanently. The article even included photographs from the final day of service. Crowds gathered. Employees gave speeches. The last train departed. The station closed. End of story. Or at least it should have been. Elliot copied the article. The next day, he showed it to his neighbor. The neighbor studied the page, read the date, examined the photographs, then handed it back. That's strange. You believe me? Of course. The station closed. Looks like it. Elliot felt relieved. Finally. Someone understood. Then the neighbor added, I took the train last month. The relief vanished instantly. The man wasn't joking. He genuinely believed both statements. The station had closed, and he had used it recently. Neither idea seemed to conflict with the other. Elliot spent the next several weeks asking variations of the same question. The responses never improved. If anything, they became stranger. One man insisted he used the train every Monday. When Elliot asked where it stopped, he couldn't answer. Another claimed he had missed a train only days earlier. When asked which day, he stared blankly. A young woman said she preferred trains over driving. She couldn't remember a single route. None of them sounded dishonest. That was the problem. Liars usually defend themselves. These people didn't. The moment details disappeared, they seemed just as confused as Elliot. But only for a few seconds. Then certainty returned, as if the uncertainty had never existed. Months passed. The mystery became part of Elliot's routine. Not an obsession, more like a splinter. Always there. Never large enough to stop life. Never small enough to ignore. One evening, he drove past the station shortly after sunset. Something caught his attention. Several people stood near the old platform. Not many. 4 or 5. They weren't talking. They weren't looking at phones. They weren't doing anything at all. They were simply standing there, facing the tracks, waiting. Elliot parked nearby. For almost 20 minutes he watched. Nobody arrived. Nothing happened. Eventually the group dispersed, one by one, without speaking, without reacting, without appearing disappointed, as though the waiting itself had been the purpose. The next day he returned. The platform was empty. The day after that, empty again. A week later, people were back. The inconsistency somehow made it worse. There was no schedule, no pattern, no obvious explanation. Only the lingering feeling that everyone knew something they couldn't explain. Years before moving to town, Elliot would have dismissed the entire thing. He would have assumed there was a misunderstanding, a rumor, a local joke. Now he wasn't so sure. Because the people involved weren't unusual. They were normal. Teachers, mechanics, cashiers, retirees, people who remembered birthdays, paid mortgages, raised families, people capable of remembering thousands of ordinary details. Yet somehow, they all shared the same impossible certainty, and none of them knew why. Eventually, Elliot stopped asking questions, not because he found answers, because he realized answers weren't coming. The station remained closed. The conversations continued. Life moved forward. Slowly, the mystery faded into the background. Months passed, then nearly a year. The station became something he rarely thought about, until one rainy morning. Elliot overslept. His alarm never went off. By the time he left home, he was already late. He rushed down the sidewalk, coffee in one hand, jacket half zipped, trying to make up lost time. As he hurried past a neighbor's yard, the neighbor looked up from his mailbox. Better hurry. Elliot slowed. What? The neighbor smiled. You'll miss the train. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The neighbor simply continued checking his mail, completely unaware that he had said anything unusual. Elliot stood frozen on the sidewalk, because something had changed. A year earlier, he would have corrected him immediately. The station is closed. There is no train. That would have been his response. Instead, he found himself looking toward the distant end of town, toward the abandoned station. And for the first time, the sentence didn't sound strange anymore. The station was still closed. He knew that. The tracks were still gone. He knew that too. Nothing had changed, except him. And standing there in the rain, Elliot realized something that unsettled him far more than the station itself. After hearing the story for long enough, he no longer felt certain either.